He abandoned her with a cruel smile and the assurance that she would simply find a way. Now, Eliza Cooper's way was to lead her 3 children through a blizzard that could rip the flesh from their bones. Every step was a battle against the cold, every breath a defiance against death. When all hope was nearly extinguished, she saw a light. But can one person's shelter be another's prison? Fleeing from one demon, was she about to knock on the door of another? Night fell not in silence, but in the shriek of a blizzard. The furious wind, like a vengeful spirit, whipped blades of ice across the valley, trying to erase every trace of life. The snow did not fall. It was thrown into blinding white walls that swallowed both trail and horizon. In this apocalyptic landscape, there was only white, and there was only despair. Eliza Cooper clutched her thin shawl tighter, but its meager warmth could not stop the cold that snaked through every layer of cloth, clinging to her very marrow. Beside her, 3 small figures trudged onward, heads bowed, faces hidden behind tattered hats. Nathan, the eldest at 10, walked with a stubborn silence, his shoulders squared, carrying the invisible burden of the only man. Leah, more fragile at 8, took each step as a trembling effort, clinging to her brother as if he were the only anchor in the storm. And Ben, sweet Ben, only 5, could only burrow into his mother's skirt, his small sobs almost swallowed by the wind's fury. Eliza's body was nearing its limit, but she could not stop. She would not stop, not after Matthew's words. His voice still echoed in her ears, sarcastic and cruel, when he had abandoned them at the desolate pass with only a few meager scraps of food. "You'll figure it out, Eliza. You always do." That betrayal was colder than the howling storm. And then, just as her legs threatened to buckle, she saw it, a pinprick of light. A fragile glimmer of hope flickered amidst the thick curtain of snow. A cabin. Strength seemed to abandon Eliza for a moment, but the thought of 3 small lives pulled her upright. "Come on, my darlings," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the wind. "We're almost there." They stumbled the last remaining distance, nearly collapsing against the wooden door. Eliza's fist was numb, but she still used all her remaining strength to beat against the wood. Once, twice, no answer. She struck again, harder, trying to call out, but her throat only produced a dry rasp. Just as hope was about to die, the door creaked open. A tall figure blocked the doorway, backlit by the flickering fire from within. His shoulders were broad, draped in a heavy coat. His face seemed carved from granite, etched with the lines of time and solitude. But it was the man's eyes that made Eliza freeze. They were deep, holding a weariness as if they had seen through the world's longest winter. For a long second, no one spoke. Words were no longer necessary. The shivering of the children clinging to their mother's skirt said everything. The man's jaw tensed. His gaze swept from Eliza's pale face down to the 3 small, huddled figures. Finally, he silently stepped back, opening a narrow path to life. "Get in." Dawn arrived like a whisper. Last night's fury was now just a tired sigh outside the wooden walls, a reminder of human fragility. Eliza was the first to wake. Her back ached from sleeping upright in a chair, but that pain vanished instantly as her eyes found her children. They were still fast asleep, curled in thick blankets, their cheeks, once pale from the cold, now rosy with warmth. For the first time in days, they looked peaceful. She stood carefully, trying not to make a sound. She looked around the cabin. In the dim morning light, there was nothing superfluous, but everything was in order. Tools were arranged neatly on the wall. A stack of books with worn spines was placed carefully near the window. The place spoke of solitude, but not of neglect. She found Jonas outside on the porch. He was splitting wood with a gleaming axe. Each swing was decisive and precise, creating a steady and solid rhythm in the quiet morning. Snow was still falling, lightly dusting his shoulders with a thin white layer. But he seemed not to mind. Eliza hesitated for a moment, then stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. "You don't need to go to such trouble for us." Jonas didn't look up, his voice steady, with the rhythm of the axe. "A fire doesn't burn on thank yous, it needs wood." A fleeting smile touched Eliza's lips, but she quickly hid it. She understood this type of man. Men who used rough actions to hide a heart that was not hardened at all. Instead of saying more, she stepped off the porch and began gathering the neatly split logs into her arms. Jonas paused for a beat, his gaze sweeping over her. There were no words, but his almost imperceptible nod was a silent approval. They worked together in that quiet, a silence that was no longer heavy, but was beginning to hold an understanding. When the woodpile was full, Jonas jutted his chin toward the door. Coffee's probably still hot. Inside, the children had begun to stir. Jonas poured a thick, black, scalding coffee into 2 tin cups. It had the bitter taste of truth and the warmth of life. Eliza took it, her numb fingers gratefully accepting the heat. "When the storm breaks, where do you plan to go?" Jonas asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Eliza hesitated. The answer caught in her throat. I'm not sure. I had thought to go west, to family. But the letters stopped a long time ago." Jonas didn't press further. He just silently sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. "You're not the first to come here thinking the West holds all the answers," he said, his voice low. "Often, all a person finds out there are just more questions." Eliza looked up at him. For a brief moment, something invisible connected them, an understanding. Both of them, in their own way, were ghosts left behind by the world. The following days passed not by a calendar, but by the rhythm of life slowly reviving. The wall of ice between the people under this roof didn't melt in a rush, but wore away bit by bit, like snow under the weak late winter sun. Nathan stuck to Jonas like a shadow, his eyes lighting up whenever he was given a real task, whether it was bringing hay to the livestock or checking the fences. He learned how to hold a hammer, how to feel the grain of the wood, how to listen to the voice of the forest. Jonas, who at first only responded with curt nods, gradually began to teach, his voice low and steady, planting seeds of confidence in the boy's heart. Leah stayed inside, helping Eliza with small chores. She was a quiet girl, but her clear eyes were always watching Jonas, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. Sometimes she would quietly ask Eliza, "Mama, why does he live all alone?" Meanwhile, Ben, with the endless curiosity of a 5-year-old, became Jonas's reluctant companion. He toddled after him everywhere, his clear voice ringing out endlessly. "What's this axe for? Do deer come in the yard? Why is the snow white?" And Jonas, with a patience he himself didn't know he possessed, answered every single one. The heavy silence of the first few days had vanished, replaced by Ben's giggles as he chased a snowflake, Leia's quiet questions, and the comfortable pauses between the two adults. The cabin was no longer merely a shelter. It was starting to have a soul. One evening, as the children played by the hearth, Eliza sat mending a shirt for her son, occasionally glancing at Jonas. He was sitting in his usual corner, holding a small piece of wood and a sharp knife. Under his rough hands, wood shavings fell away, and a shape began to emerge. Eliza realized it was a small wolf, its head held high, every line exuding a wildness that wasn't fierce. It was just like him. "You have the hands of a carpenter, but the soul of an artist," she said softly. Jonas didn't look up, but his hands paused for a second. An almost invisible smile flickered across the corner of his weathered lips. Just for a moment, but Eliza saw it. And inside her, something warm bloomed. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together in the quiet of the firelight. The storm outside had completely vanished, but Eliza knew that the real storm, the one inside each of them, had perhaps only just begun to calm. The fragile piece was like a thin sheet of ice over a lake, and then it was shattered by a sound that did not belong here. Oh, diva, it is. It wasn't the hurried footfalls of a hunter, nor the leisurely rhythm of a traveler. It was the rhythm of power, of ownership, of one who believes the ground beneath his feet belongs to him. Jonas was the first to sense it. Not with his ears, but with an instinct honed through many lonely winters. He set down the piece of wood he was carving, his eyes narrowing toward the trail that appeared and disappeared behind the trees. Eliza, sensing his sudden tension, stopped her work and looked too. A rider emerged from the edge of the forest, followed by two more. The man in the lead sat on his horse with an uprightness that didn't belong here, his dark wool coat looking out of place in the wild landscape. He removed his gloves slowly, revealing a smile that was sickeningly familiar. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the cold smile of a predator that has cornered its prey. The air in Eliza's lungs seemed to freeze. A name escaped her lips, not as a greeting, but like a forgotten curse. Matthew. He dismounted, his polished leather boots sinking slightly into the mud and melting snow. "Hello, Eliza," Matthew Crowley said, his smooth voice like a layer of oil on still water. "It was a long road to find you." Eliza instinctively took a step back, blocking the doorway where the children were curiously peeking out. "What are you doing here?" Her voice trembled, but there was a firmness in it that surprised even her. Matthew's smile widened. "Such a cold welcome for your husband." "I've had time to reflect. It's clear that you and the children need proper care, a man's hand to guide you." "You are not welcome here," Jonas's voice rang out, not loud but sharp as flint. He had come to stand beside Eliza, his solid frame like a rampart. Matthew's lazy gaze shifted to Jonas, sizing him up. "Ah, the hero of the woods, I presume," he sneered. "I suppose I should thank you for looking after my property." "They are not property," Jonas growled, his jaw set. "And you lost the right to call them yours when you left them for the winter." Matthew's feigned charm began to crack. "I am here to take back what belongs to me. By law," he stressed. "I've already spoken with the sheriff in town. I am their father, by blood and by law." The word law struck Eliza like a physical blow. She could face his cruelty, but how could she fight a law made by men like him, to protect men like him? Matthew saw the fear in her eyes, and he savored it. "I will return at noon tomorrow," he declared, his tone light, as if discussing the weather, with a representative of the law. "You have one night to say your goodbyes. Don't make things ugly, Eliza." With that he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away with his two men. They left behind not just tracks of mud on the snow, but a deathly silence that enveloped the cabin. The warmth, the laughter, all the newly sprouted life seemed to have been swallowed by his shadow. That night, the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It became a tomb of silence and fear. The fire flickered in the hearth, but it no longer brought warmth. It only illuminated the ghosts of anxiety dancing on the walls. Ben's sobs had subsided into a restless sleep, but Nathan's silence, taut as a bowstring, and Leah's worried hand-squeezing were even more terrifying. Eliza paced the small room, her hands wrung so tightly her knuckles turned white. Matthew's voice replayed in her head, not his threats, but his vicious confidence. "What am I going to do?" She whispered to the air, her voice breaking. "How can I fight him? He has money. He has connections. He even has the law in his hand, a law written by men like him, to protect men like him." Jonas just sat there, by the wooden table, silent as a mountain. His gaze wasn't on Eliza, but fixed on the fire, as if searching for answers in the dancing flames. "He thinks paper and threats can break people," Jonas finally said, his voice low and steady, cutting through Eliza's desperate thoughts. "But he's forgotten one thing. Paper can't keep a child warm on a winter night." And his law has no value where human hearts know the truth. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, his deep eyes were not weary, but shone with a fierce resolve. This town has seen you. They saw you rise from the ashes. They saw you raise these children with love, not with ownership. He is counting on fear to keep you silent. But we will not be silent. The word "we" hung in the air, carrying an extraordinary weight. But if he uses force? Eliza asked, her voice a whisper of her last remaining fear. If he takes them? Jonas stood, his shadow stretching across the floor, large and protective. He stepped in front of her, and for the first time, she did not feel overwhelmed by his presence, but safe. Then he'll have to step over my body first. The statement was not a boast. It was an oath, spoken in a voice as calm and certain as bedrock. Eliza looked up at him, tears finally welling in her eyes. Her trembling hand came to rest on his firm arm. You would do that for us? Jonas looked down at her hand, then directly into her eyes. I'm not doing it for you, he said, his voice softening unexpectedly. I'm doing it for family. Something inside Eliza broke, but it was not weakness. This time she didn't cry. The tears were exhausted, leaving only a steely resolve. She nodded a firm, decisive nod. Then we will stand together. Outside, the cold wind still blew through the trees. But inside the cabin, two souls that had thought themselves broken had just drawn a line together in the snow. And when dawn came, Matthew Crowley would find out the consequence of crossing it. The air of that noon seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken things. Jonas didn't clean his rifle with the haste of a man going to battle. He did it with the calm of a man protecting his territory. Eliza had dressed the children in their best clothes, not to leave, but to assert their dignity. Nathan stood by the window, his eyes no longer fearful, but filled with a nascent defiance. And then they came. The sound of hooves this time was no longer solitary confidence, but the imposition of organized power. Matthew led the way, and beside him was Sheriff Tate, a man with a tired face, who always wanted to avoid trouble more than solve it. Matthew dismounted with a triumphant smile. He believed the game was over. Eliza, he called out. I've kept my word. It's time to bring my children home. The wooden door opened. Eliza stepped out, her back straight, her shoulders not betraying a single tremor. Jonas stood right behind her, his presence more solid than the ancient trees around them. This is their home. Eliza's voice rang out, clear and steady. Matthew's smile faded. Don't be needlessly stubborn. Tate, show her the papers. The sheriff awkwardly unfolded a yellowed piece of paper and began to read in a flat, emotionless voice. Mrs. Eliza Cooper, by order of the court, you are required to relinquish custody of the children, Nathan, Leah, and Ben Cooper, to their legal father, Mr. Matthew Crowley. Failure to comply. That's enough, Tate, Jonas interrupted, his voice not loud but carrying a weight that made the sheriff look up. Jonas stepped forward, positioning himself completely in front of Eliza. He didn't look at the sheriff. His eyes were locked on Matthew. That paper might say he is their father, Jonas said, his voice cold and sharp. But it doesn't say how he abandoned them to wolves and blizzards. It doesn't talk about the nights they shivered from cold or this mother's tears. Your law may be blind, but the eyes of the people who live here are not. And as if to prove his words, figures began to emerge from the edge of the forest. Mrs. Webb from the general store, Pastor Connor, old Doc Briggs, and then more. Farmers with calloused hands, women with resolute eyes. They didn't carry weapons. They only carried their presence, standing as a silent but unshakable wall behind Jonas and Eliza. We stand with her. Mrs. Webb said simply, her voice firm. The smugness on Matthew's face crumbled, replaced by confusion and then rage. This is none of your business, he hissed. Sheriff Tate looked at the growing crowd, then back at the soulless paper. In his hand, he sighed, a breath of weary resignation. "Crowley, I may have the law," he said quietly, just loud enough for Matthew to hear. "But Jonas has this entire valley behind him. I can't arrest an entire valley." Matthew's face contorted with impotent rage. He snatched the paper from the sheriff's hand, crumpled it, and threw it to the ground. He glared at Jonas, at Eliza, at the whole crowd. "This isn't over." He climbed onto his horse and galloped away, followed by a visibly relieved sheriff. "No," Jonas replied to the empty air, his voice as calm as a lake after a storm. "It's just beginning." The crowd didn't cheer. They just gave Eliza quiet nods and warm looks before slowly returning to their homes. They had come when it mattered. That was enough. Inside the cabin, the tension broke. Eliza looked at Jonas, and for the first time, she saw not just the man who had saved her, but the man who had stood with her. And she knew that this house was now truly a fortress. The days after the confrontation passed in an almost unreal peace. Spring was no longer a distant promise. It was seeping into every crack in the earth, awakening life with the gurgle of water and the new green of leaves. The shadow of Matthew Crowley still lingered somewhere out there, but it had faded, pushed back by the laughter of children and the warmth that was slowly filling the cabin. A new rhythm of life was formed, not by words, but by familiar habits. Jonas showed Nathan how to read tracks in the damp earth, how to distinguish the songs of different birds, lessons not found in books, but only learned from the land. Leah, with her gentle nature, took it upon herself to care for the pots of wildflowers Eliza had planted by the window. And Ben, no longer timid, his pitter-pattering feet were the first sound of the day and the last before night fell. One evening, Jonas gave Ben a gift. It was a small bear carved from pine, sturdy and gentle. The boy clutched it constantly, a silent wooden companion. For the first time in a very long time, Eliza laughed, a laugh that was clear and unburdened. The sound made Jonas pause. He looked at her with surprise and tenderness. It had been so long since this house had heard such a sound. That night, when the children were fast asleep and only the crackling of embers remained, a comfortable silence enveloped them. It was Eliza who broke it. "Do you ever regret it, Jonas?" she asked softly, her voice a whisper. "Opening the door that day?" Jonas set down the knife and the piece of wood he was working on. He looked at his calloused hands, then up at her. "For years," he began, his voice raspy with rarely expressed emotion, "I built these walls not just to keep out the cold, but to keep in the memories. I thought silence was the only way to keep the broken pieces from cutting me anymore." He paused, his gaze distant. "But then you came. And I realized, a house without the laughter of children is just an empty shell." A lump formed in Eliza's throat. "We never intended to stay so long." Jonas looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw their full tenderness. "I also never intended to want you to." He reached out his hand, and she did not hesitate to place hers in it. Their fingers intertwined, a natural and fitting connection. "Can we stay?" she whispered, the question holding all her hopes and fears. "Truly stay?" Jonas squeezed her hand gently. "Eliza, this place stopped being just mine the day you and the children brought life back to it. It's ours." He took a deep breath. "Stay and make it our home." That was all she needed to hear. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of release. She stood, crossed the small space between them, and hugged him. Jonas's arms wrapped tightly around her, an embrace of protection, of promise, of homecoming. Nathan quietly padded out of the bedroom. He found Jonas standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. "Mr. Jonas?" Jonas turned, a little surprised. Nathan hesitated. "Now, is this place really our home?" Jonas smiled, a true smile. "Yes, Nathan, this is home." The boy nodded, his face filled with relief. But before he turned away, he asked one more question in a tiny voice. "So, can I call you by another name?" Jonas said nothing. He just knelt on one knee, pulling the boy into a tight hug, a hug that said everything words could not. From the darkness of the doorway, Eliza saw it all, her hand resting over her own beating heart. The home had found its voice. And it was the voice of family. Spring had truly arrived, laying a green carpet across the hillsides and filling the air with the scent of damp earth and rebirth. The stream behind the cabin now sang a cheerful tune instead of its icy sigh. But the past, like a ghost of winter, still had one last visit to make. The sound of a lone horse echoed on the trail. Jonas knew the sound, but this time it lacked arrogance. He was standing on the porch, holding a tool in need of repair, but he had set it down even before the figure appeared. It was Matthew Crowley. He was alone. No more smugness, no more expensive coat. Just a man with heavy shoulders and empty eyes. Defeat had eroded him, leaving an empty shell, the dust of a long journey clinging to his clothes. This time, Eliza didn't stand behind Jonas. She stood beside him. And the children stood beside her. They didn't hide. They weren't afraid. They were an impenetrable barrier, built not of wood and stone, but of love and connection. Matthew stopped his horse. He looked at them, a real family, and something in his eyes broke. "I came to talk," he said, his voice hoarse, devoid of its false smoothness. "There's nothing left to say, Matthew," Eliza replied, her voice surprisingly calm, like an undisturbed lake. "Your words melted with the snow. They are my children." He cried out weakly, a final attempt to cling to the only power he thought he had left. "They carry my blood." "Blood can't tell a child a bedtime story," Jonas said, his voice calm but every word sharp. "Blood can't teach a boy how to be a man. And blood certainly can't mend a heart that it, itself, has broken." Matthew stared, speechless. But the decisive blow came not from Jonas or Eliza. Nathan took a small step forward, facing the other man directly. "You are not our father," the boy said, his voice articulate and clear, without a trace of fear. Leah, with her clear eyes, added, "Our father is here," her small hand pointing towards Jonas. And then Ben. He said nothing, but his action was louder than all the words. He ran and hid behind Jonas's leg, his small hand clutching his trouser leg as if it were the safest place on earth. Those words, especially Ben's action, were like the final cut severing his last ties to this world. He looked at the children, the beings he had discarded, now belonging completely to another world, a world he could never touch. He had nothing left. He staggered back, mounting his horse like a sleepwalker. And as he rode away, disappearing behind the green hills, no one looked back. He simply vanished, like a final bad memory that is faded. On the porch, Eliza exhaled a long breath, a breath she seemed to have been holding all winter. Jonas placed a hand on her shoulder, a gentle, comforting squeeze. Finally, winter had truly melted. That evening fell not with darkness, but with a honey-colored light that gilded the whole valley. The cabin now seemed to breathe, inhaling the fresh spring air and exhaling a thin wisp of smoke from its chimney, a sign of life and warmth. Gurgle of the stream and the chorus of crickets had replaced the howl of the long-gone winter wind. Inside, after dinner, the children had fallen asleep, their dreams no longer haunted by fear. Jonas sat in his familiar chair by the hearth, his hands slowly putting the finishing touches on a wooden toy. He no longer carved to ward off loneliness. He carved to create joy. Eliza approached, placing a hot cup of tea on the small table beside him. She didn't sit in her own chair, but sat on the floor, leaning against his, watching the dancing flames. "I used to think a home was just made of wood and stone," she said, her voice as soft as the firelight. "Now I know it's made of other things." Jonas stopped his work, looking down at the top of her head. "From what, Eliza?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "From the courage of a man who didn't turn his back on a blizzard," she replied. "From the laughter of children. And from the silence that we can share together." He set the finished toy aside. "You and the children have filled the empty spaces in this house," he said, his voice warm and deep. "Spaces I didn't even know existed." He stood, brushing the wood shavings from his hands, and reached out, pulling her up with him. Their kiss didn't have the rush of passion, but the depth of a river that has found its way to the sea. It was the confirmation of all that had been unsaid, the promise of all the mornings to come. When they parted, she rested her head on his steady chest, listening to the strong, even beat within. "Jonas," she whispered, "we're no longer just trying to survive." He tightened his embrace. "No, Eliza," he answered, his voice a vow more certain than the mountains. "We are living." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they both believed it completely, because love sometimes isn't a tempest. It is a fire patiently, kindled in a winter's night, a home built not by blood, but by choice. They had not just survived the winter. They had found a spring of their very own,